share that as well. So today is all about grant making guidelines, what our priority areas look like, giving you all as potential applicants a sense of what our grant making looks like and how we fund folks and what the process is. So I am going to ask you all to introduce yourselves in the chat here in just a second. You are all muted just because there's quite a few folks. It was going to be a little unwieldy to let everyone sort of talk freely, unfortunately, but at the end, I'm happy to unmute everybody. I'm going to give you a bit of background on Chinook, our history as a community foundation here in Colorado, a sense of what our grant making framework, why we do the things that we do and the way that we do them, what our giving project looks like. That's our primary grant making mechanism right now. What our grant making process looks like. We have 2 grant cycles a year. We're coming up on the spring cycle. The specific criteria that our giving project members use to understand if your organization is in alignment with our grant making. Pretty clear list of what we do and do not fund. A deep dive in on community organizing. That's our primary priority area right now as we're getting more and more applications, as more folks are hearing about Chinook Fund. That's really where we're focusing our grant making. I'll give you an overview of our grantees, past and present. And then we're going to do a deep dive into the logistics part, what our portal looks like, what specific information we're going to request from you all. And then, our basic contact information and deadline. So if you all don't mind just sharing in the chat your name, your pronouns, and your organization, just so that, I can see who all is in this call today, and then you all can see who your peers are. I do miss having these workshops in person, getting a sense of community in the room, and a lot of times folks have areas of overlap in their organizations they may not have known about before. So feel free to connect with each other in the chat if that feels appropriate. I also want to say I have 2 cats, and one of them has become very attached to me during this work from home quarantine time, so he may be jumping on screen. Sometimes I can't control him, just as an FYI. So I'm sharing here a grantee quote that was shared with us. We do often do grant making evaluations. And we do, I want to lift up that some folks use our definitions of social change as, a way to progress their own social movement work forward. And so, that's definitely a real possibility as you're getting more comfortable with, the way we think about grant making, as opposed to what traditional philanthropy often looks like. Feel free to take, what you learned today back home with you to talk about with your coworkers and colleagues, and yeah. So history of Chinook Fund. We've been around since 1987, believe it or not. You can see this old photo we found digging through archives. What is funny in there is that you can see old Hickenlooper, one of the founders of Chinook Fund, believe it or not, back in the day. Started in 1987 by a group of young, wealthy white philanthropists who wanted to change what traditional philanthropy looked like, move power back to those folks that are most affected by oppression, by situations of injustice. And so modeled the organization off of a funder network that is now defunct called the Funding Exchange that was in New York. And there was a network of sister funds all across the country that were doing community-led grant making. And so for, the first 28 years of Chinook Fund's history, we were granting through a grant making committee that was led by a group of folks who were activists doing work on the ground in collaboration with major donors and Chinook Fund folks who are making decisions. And we found that grant making model, though very true to community, wasn't bringing in the kind of money that we needed to keep Chinook Fund going. So we shifted to this model called the Giving Project that we use today, where we recruit folks from the community who are engaging in fundraising as well as grant making, and I'll talk about that in detail in a bit here. But it's a model that's being adopted by community-led grant makers and funders all across the country to democratize philanthropy and sort of change up those traditional power structures. Also, a recent update in terms of Chinook Fund's history. We did in the beginning of this summer, in response to COVID, in response to the uprisings, develop a new grant making stream called the Another World is Possible Fund. And this funding is reserved specifically to organizations that have already been funded through this grant making process that I'm going to describe in detail today. And the fund is in collaboration with Transformative Leadership for Change. So the funding stream is also available to groups that have gone through that specific cohort as well. So, if you decide to apply and are funded through our regular giving project, deliberated grant making sessions, then you're also eligible to apply for an Another World is Possible fund. And I'm happy to answer questions about that if they come up. This is a picture of our board. It is unfortunately outdated because we haven't been all together in quite a while, but you can see some of the folks that have been in leadership and still are in leadership at Chinook. So this hopefully not super fuzzy image here is other organizations that funders that have taken on our specific grant making model, the Giving Project. So you can see all across the country there are folks that are doing this kind of grant making. Though you can see we're kind of alone here in the middle of the country in terms of the kind of work that we're doing. But if you have colleagues, comrades, folks who are doing social justice community organizing work all across the country, I'm happy to share this information with you to see if maybe there's a funder that might be a good fit for them. So this is our mission. I'm just going to give you a good overview of Chinook Fund as we settle in here. So we support grassroots organizations working on issues of social and economic justice. By pooling our collective resources, we seed groups making a positive systemic impact to improve the quality of life for all Coloradans. And then I just want to talk through our values. I believe that all of these values are really evident in the way that we do our grant making, the way we show up in community, the way we show up for our community. So our 4 values here are liberation, community, integrity, and leadership. And the way that we define liberation is in our words and actions, we honor the inherent dignity, strength, and wisdom of the individual and the collective. We actively challenge practices that dehumanize and isolate people and cultivate practices that bring people together across our differences to achieve community-led systemic change, justice, and peace. We believe everyone has a role to play in collective liberation. And our definition for community, we build caring, respectful relationships with one another, recognizing our interdependence. We are committed to action that moves us all closer to our vision of liberation, connection, and abundance. We honor our relationship with the natural world, which sustains us all. Integrity, we are honest, accessible, and transparent in our work and advocate for the same in our partner organizations and in the field of philanthropy. We understand the power and responsibility that comes with being a steward of financial resources and are accountable to our constituents. And then finally, leadership. We encourage learning, experimentation, and innovative thinking, as well as support the development of grassroots leaders. We embrace our role as leaders in the movement for social justice philanthropy and are willing to take strategic risks in service of our vision of abundantly resourced movements. So this is really like what is guiding us as a foundation, as a staff, how we're making grant making decisions, and how we operate as an organization. So I just wanted to share these 6 tenets of social justice philanthropy that we're borrowing from Resource Generation, an organization we collaborate with that works with young donors of high net wealth looking to redistribute those funds to movement work. And these are the pieces that sort of guide how our grant making priority areas are decided upon, where our grant making criteria came from. So this is sort of we're going from meta view down into the nitty gritty as we're going to work through this today. So social justice philanthropy focuses on the root causes of economic, racial, and social injustice. We're really looking to move money to organizations that are, keyed in on those root causes and looking to make systemic change to affect those. 2, social justice philanthropy strives to include the people who are impacted by those injustices as leaders and decision makers. You'll see on our board, on our staff, and in the organizations that we fund, we really value constituent leadership over everything. It's really one of the key pieces in terms of the work that we do. 3, social justice philanthropy also aims to make the field of philanthropy more accessible and diverse. So in addition to, how we think about the groups that we fund, we're also moving this information and our sort of ethos of grant making out into traditional philanthropy as well, which feels really good to sort of push bigger funders to think about these pieces as well. In social justice philanthropy, foundations are accountable, transparent, and responsive in their grant making. I'll say our Another World is Possible fund was, our first rapid response funding in several years to, show up for our communities in the ways that they needed it. Just giving out $3,000 grants to, those folks that applied without any final reporting requirements, just trying to move money to folks that needed it. 5, donors and foundations act as allies to social justice movements by contributing not only monetary resources, but their time, knowledge, skills, and access. And 6, foundations use their assets and investments alongside grant-making dollars to support their social justice missions. So at Chinook, we do have an endowment, and we're working to move that endowment into more local efforts, in order to, move money out of the sort of traditional places that are upholding systems of oppression back into, moving those funds into local community. I'm happy to answer any questions about that too, if you all have it. But this is sort of the meta view of our type of philanthropy. And so, how do we actually move funds? What does our grant making look like? Who's making decisions? So the decisions are coming from this model called the Giving Project. And so we have a Giving Project that sort of runs tandem to our grant making cycle that you all are privy to. And we are, recruiting about 25 folks each grant making cycle, intentionally across race and across class lines. So folks are bringing a wide variety of experience into this process, and they're committing to 6 months with Chinook Fund in the Giving Project, learning about our specific type of grant making, building their skills, and then being the actual folks who are running the decision making process in the grant making. So there's 3 phases of the Giving Project. The first one is what our spring folks are in right now. They're just getting to know each other. Of course, we shifted online, so it's been an interesting transition to try and build community, over Zoom, but it's happening. People are connecting. It's really beautiful and lovely to see. We're such adaptable creatures as humans. And so the first phase is community building and then social justice analysis. So the folks that go through the Giving Project are sort of indoctrinated to our anti-racist framework, our, so racial and economic justice positions, our anti-oppression frameworks, sort of taking a deep dive into the foundation on which Chinook Fund is built. And then they move into phase 2, where they're learning about grant making and they're learning about fundraising. So gaining valuable skills on how to ask people for money. And then taking that social justice analysis, the skills building through a series of workshops over the 6 months of the Giving Project, then moving that into action. So folks are actively giving funds from their own personal contributions and soliciting funds from their networks. And all of those funds go into the grant making pool for that specific grant making cycle. And then they decide which organizations are funded, they go on site visits, they make those final decisions and actually move that money out to all of our grantees. So that is the short and short of the Giving Project in terms of process. And so those folks are already hard at work learning how to be good grant makers and working through the process. And Kat, yes, all of the slides will be up for you to view on our website, and I'm happy to send those to you afterwards as well. So I just want to give you a sense of the timeline. So what are we working with here in terms of this 6-month process, and what are the parts that are relevant to you all as applicants? You can see this pathway here is kind of the pathway that the Giving Project folks are following. So getting to know each other, working through our anti-oppression frameworks. There's a Meet the Changemakers grantee panel that I'll share more about later, where they get to like hear from our grantees specifically to see, well, who are they fundraising for? Who are they raising the dollars for? What kind of groups? Then learning about fundraising, screening applications, reading all of the grants that come in, going on site visits, and then making those final decisions. So the pieces that are relevant to you all as potential applicants are applications being due. So the deadline is the 22nd of February. So, a little over a month. I do just want to make a note that if you are currently in the Giving Project, I don't believe that's the case for anyone here, but if this seems like it's something of interest to you, you can't do both the applicant side and the Giving Project side. That is definitely a conflict of interest. But I often recommend that folks who aren't totally sure if they're a good fit for Chinook Fund and they're interested in all of the skills building opportunities of the Giving Project, to go through the Giving Project first before applying. If you feel like you have that capacity, you really learn a lot about that is sort of insider knowledge about what it means to be a Giving Project participant. The Meet the Changemakers, I recommend that most applicants join. The next one is March 30th. So, that will happen after the deadline, but still totally recommend joining so you can hear directly from some of our grantees about the kind of work that they're doing in community right now. The screening meeting is when Giving Project folks decide which organizations they want to site visit, and then which organizations they don't feel like are a good fit with our criteria. So that's sort of the first elimination round in the process. Then, if you are selected for a site visit, Giving Project folks will reach out to you to schedule that. And then they'll bring all the knowledge that is gained at the site visits back to the group, and then there will be a final decisions meeting. And then after that, staff will reach out to let you know if you are funded or if not, and the rationale as to why. So this is a sort of big overview in terms of timeline. Yes, I'm happy to share more about the Meet the Changemakers event. So it's a panel of our current grantees where they're sharing about what organizing looks like right now for them, the kind of work that they're working on. In the context of the Giving Project, it's often used as a sort of a fundraising pitch for folks who are going to ask their community for funds, to give them a sense of this is where your money might go to if you're funding, if you're going to contribute to a Giving Project cycle. Hopefully that helps, but happy to answer more questions that come up. So now we're going to move into how do you know if you're a good fit to apply for Chinook funding, and what kind of things are we looking for? So in terms of determining alignment, there are 3 key criteria areas that we're looking at. The first is, are you constituent-led? The second is, are you community-wide? And the third is, are you creating our definition of a lasting effect, or are you creating systemic change? Because that's where our money is really focused right now. So our definition for constituent-led is, the work is led by the people most impacted by the injustice. We believe that those most affected by injustice have the vision and solutions for their own liberation. So not doing work for, it's doing work with your community. Community-wide, I think it's a good analogy with intersectionality. So, does the work reflect all members of the constituency and community, particularly those who experience multiple forms of oppression? So this is basically saying, we don't want you to leave anybody behind. Folks who aren't, maybe not typically included at the forefront of a movement. Are you including folks of different abilities, different racial backgrounds and ethnicities, different sexualities, to make sure that you're not leaving out folks from the work that you're doing, the voices that are at the table. And then finally, lasting effect, systemic change. The work makes meaningful change for the community as a whole and for future generations, not just one individual in the immediate future. And we're going to dig into all of these as well. So all successful applicants must, these all kind of relate to the criteria here. So be based in communities that are facing injustice or oppression, have democratic leadership and decision-making that is led by and accountable to those directly impacted by the issue. We don't fund organizations that are just led by one person. All applicants must engage in dismantling privilege and oppression within their organization and community. This sort of leads to that community-wide piece. And then finally, demonstrate that their work can lead to permanent progressive change for their community. So we do want to note here that the Giving Project, we're part of a national collaborative of funds that are also doing this work. And in terms of, our popular education frameworks, we're really centering Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty is our national priority. That's not to say that that's the only kind of work that we fund, but it's where we're coming from when we're looking at systems of oppression and sort of our racial analysis as we're considering grant applications. And it's the communities and voices that we're really working to center in our work, sort of on an internal piece and an external piece. But do want to note that's not the only kind of work that we fund. We prioritize applicants who are working in alliance and collaboration with other organizations. We know the nonprofit industrial complex, folks tend to be siloed and there are lots of organizations that are doing the same kind of work. We want to know that you're working with folks who are in community with you and building power in that way. We want to prioritize folks who are strategic and work with a long-term vision that's clearly linked to the current work plans that are going to be asked for in your application. We want to know what kind of successes you've achieved. We want to prioritize folks who have concrete successes that have positively impacted the community. Though I will note, that sort of priority area is different for our startup grantees versus our established grantees, and I'll talk more about that later. We prioritize folks who see themselves as part of a larger movement for social justice. So how are you connected to national movements who are also doing work like yours? We prioritize applicants who shift paradigms and offer alternatives to existing institutions and systems that perpetuate injustice. We realize that, sometimes some part of the work is just helping folks navigate their way through systems, but our priority area is folks who want to dismantle and build new systems as opposed to solely help folks navigate current systems. And finally, prioritizing applicants who take risks. We want to fund that risky new emerging work that's coming up for, you and your community right now, especially, in the wake of this pandemic and all of the gnarly stuff that's happening nationally. We want to fund responses to that, taking care of your communities and pushing for change. And then finally, we want to know that you're evaluating your work and making changes as appropriate. And then what we do not fund, the sort of big three here are organizations whose work and decision-making is based outside of Colorado. Unless you are part of an Indigenous group whose borders are different or, don't necessarily recognize the state lines of Colorado, but overlap. So happy to answer any questions about that, but that's kind of the big piece here. We're Colorado-based and we want to fund locally. And we don't fund organizations with budgets over $350,000, with the exceptions made for capital campaigns if you are fiscally sponsoring organizations, but your operational budget needs to be under $350,000. Our grants are small and limited in terms of how many organizations we're able to fund. So that's where we're really focusing on groups with those smaller budgets. And then we do not fund groups that do exclusively direct services work. Oftentimes, particularly for our rural grantees, they're doing direct services in combination with more organizing work, or direct services is sort of the pipeline to organizing work. And that's great, but if you're only doing direct services, you're not a good fit for Chinook. And then the other things that we don't fund, like I said earlier, organizations controlled by one individual or individuals. We want to know that your work has community backing and community support. We do not fund scholarship requests. We don't fund profit-making organizations unless you're a worker-owned cooperative. And if that's the case, please reach out to me. I just want to check in with you before you apply. We do not fund other foundations or pass-through funding. We don't fund attempts to influence the election of individuals for public office. This has to do with 501c3 stuff. So we don't want to be out of compliance with any 501c3 regulations. And then we also don't fund direct union organizing. So hopefully those are all clear, but I am more than happy to answer questions that come up. And then sort of just going to do a deep dive here into these 3 criteria, because this is the key piece that our Giving Project folks are looking at when they're reviewing your application and deciding whether they want to go on a site visit with a group that's applied. And these are the questions that are going to be asked of your application. So in terms of constituent-led, showing that the work is led by those folks that are most impacted by that situation of injustice. So how do you demonstrate that your work is driven by the people that this situation affects? Does leadership reflect the people most affected by an issue? Are they holding roles where they can shape the strategies in terms of their own liberation? And then in particular, youth organizing, we want to know how is youth voice being incorporated into leadership? Typically, this looks like a youth advisory board or some other decision-making body. You'll see in the application itself, there's a place to add other leadership. And that's where we want to hear about any advisory bodies who are informing the work that you're doing that maybe, youth aren't on staff, maybe they're not 18, so they can't be on the board, but how are you making sure that you're getting input by those folks that are being affected? Community-wide, so these are the questions they're going to be asking of your application to see if you're community-wide. Does this organization work towards change that will affect all members of the constituency that are exploited, oppressed, or marginalized? In particular, thinking about folks who live at the intersection of multiple oppressions. Are you including them? How do you know? And this doesn't mean you have a person of all of the different identities tokenized on your board or on your staff. It could look like very intentional collaboration and accountability with folks that represent that sort of more intersectional identity for your folks. There's not one way to do this, and we don't want to tell you how to do your work. Is the organization working to build a multiracial, multi-class, multi-gendered social justice movement? So what does your outreach look like? How do you know that you're reaching out to all the folks in your community? And like I said, intersectionality versus diversity. This doesn't mean you have a person from all of the different potential identities, but just how are you being intentional with including those voices? And finally, lasting effect. So we're talking about upstream, systemic, strategic change. So will the proposed work help build concrete and lasting political power to address the underlying causes of the problems that it addresses? So it's like the right now and future generations. And how does the organization define the root cause of the issue that they're working to change? So, I'm happy to answer questions about those 3 criteria. Those are really the key pieces of alignment. And then now we're going to move into, what our priority areas are looking like right now. So this isn't, saying rural organizations here. It's not the only thing that we fund, but I'll be sharing a little bit more about why we're prioritizing rural organizations specifically. But special consideration is given to groups based outside of the Front Range. And a big part of that is because we know that folks who are outside of the Front Range just have less access to resources. And so we want to be intentional about moving more money to folks who are outside of the Front Range. And then sort of our big piece here in terms of what we're prioritizing is community organizing. And our definition here is the process of bringing affected people together to use their collective power to win improvements in their community and change the power structure to advance social justice. So hopefully you can see the parallels to this definition of community organizing as with the 3 criteria that just covered. So a great example of community organizing is the Denver Justice Project. I know they had recently had a resurgence in support and activity in response to the summer uprising. Community members coming together to push for change, in this case, around the criminal justice system and what policing looks like in our communities here in Denver. And then what I'm going to do next, and I want to just take a little time to pause before moving into this deeper dive around what we think community organizing looks like, our definition, to give you all a little bit of space to ask any questions in the chat about the 3 criteria before I roll on. But what I'm going to move into next here is sort of a deeper dive on what community organizing looks like and what different types of social change can look like that isn't necessarily our priority area right now. So, you know, in terms of this exercise, we have, social justice type work broken into 4 different categories: community organizing, services, empowerment, education, and advocacy. And a lot of times the groups that we fund are doing some aspect of all 4 of these things. And I'm going to share some examples of what these items look like and why we're prioritizing community organizing. So definition of services: supplying basic services to people who need them, often to meet basic needs such as food, healthcare, shelter, transportation, etc. And just a note, this framework and exercise is something that the Giving Project folks also go through to sort of delineate what does community organizing actually look like. So here's an example of a services-based organization. Women's Health, and of course this is not a real organization, these are fictional. Women's Health Alternative is a community-based health center. They provide birth control, free pregnancy tests, well women care, and abortions. They also have a fund that offers financial support to people who can't pay for their services. And they offer financial support to people who have to travel out of town for their abortion and need to stay in a hotel or pay for gas. So hopefully you can see, you know, they're providing direct services that help one individual in a moment of need. Next is defining empowerment. So this is providing programs that focus on supporting positive identity development and self-esteem among marginalized groups of people. So an example here, again, a fictional organization. Healthy You, Healthy Us is a youth program led by the county health department. They would work in public schools, teaching 12-week comprehensive sex ed classes. Students learn about safer sex, contraception options, sexuality, and healthy communication. Middle school and high school students are paired with student mentors who have graduated from the program already. And they have an after-school program where the students do service projects in the community. So you can see that this is more an internal work as opposed to external. And of course, you know, services, empowerment, education, and advocacy, all really important work, but this is just to sort of share where we're focusing our funding right now. So more internal as opposed to external systems change work here. Education and advocacy. So we're defining this as raising the visibility of a cause and advocating for or against policies on behalf of a group affected by the problem to lawmakers, decision makers, media, and other stakeholders. So this is for a community as opposed to with, you know, your own community that you're serving. Education and advocacy. So an example here, Act for Reproductive Rights is a state affiliate of a national organization dedicated to making abortion accessible to all. They fight anti-abortion laws and lobby to secure pro-choice policies across the state. They've created an annual policy report card and an app to download to stay up to date on reproductive rights legislation coming down the pipe, but they have no people from the local community with intersecting identities and positions in the organization. So you can see you're not yet fully meeting our 3 criteria, nor fully community organizing in this example. And then finally, community organizing with the definition that I shared. And I'll say, you know, often I have conversations with applicants who aren't exactly meeting this priority area or meeting our 3 criteria, and I will share those three definitions, you know, in terms of saying, oh, maybe your work actually falls under empowerment as opposed to community organizing as a rationale for not being funded, just as an FYI. So an example here of what community organizing can look like. Powerful Families is this fictional organization, women of color led organization working for reproductive justice across the state. They're working for more than abortion rights only. They're talking about access to abortions in rural areas, access to contraception, the right to have children, the ability to parent children with dignity, healthcare, housing, etc. After conducting a series of listening sessions over the past year, Powerful Families created a community report, and now they're partnering with other groups from around the state to lobby at the Capitol about abortion access for people who don't qualify for Medicaid, undocumented immigrants, and people who have been legal permanent residents for less than 5 years. So hopefully you can see how this example, you know, really sort of integrates those three criteria that I was talking about in terms of a group that would be really strongly aligned with potential Chinook funding. So it looks like I have some questions here. Could you share some examples of organizations working on Indigenous sovereignty? Yeah, so one of our grantees right now, Herbal Gardens Wellness, I think is a great example of Indigenous sovereignty. Spirit of the Sun is a group that we funded. Move Mountains Project and Land Rights Council is sort of like Indigenous Chicana-led organization that's doing that kind of work. Though if you go to our website, and I'm happy to share that link, you can see some more examples of groups that sort of fall under that Indigenous sovereignty work. And then nonprofits that deliver direct services. So you could be eligible for funding if you do primarily direct services work, if there is an organizing and you know, direct action component to your work. But if you are primarily only providing direct services, then you wouldn't be a good fit for Chinook funding, Kelly, and I'm happy to chat with you more after we get through more of this logistical information to see if you're a good fit or not. Do folks have any questions about this framework? I know it's, you know, typically I run this where, you know, we're in person and you have some moments to review all of those examples and decide which organization fits into which framework, but it's just kind of difficult to do. So I'm happy to answer any more questions about what community organizing looks like, because, you know, it can look different than what that example was. So feel free to chat in. Other components of community organizing work, if you're wondering if you align, is having a grassroots base of support. You know, you have folks from the community who are saying, yes, this is what we need. A strategic direction driven by that base. So what are you trying to change? Where are you going with the work that you're doing? Clear demands for policy and systems change. This is a key one. So like, what are the things that folks are saying they want to change? What are you working towards? How do you know? A power map. So that is essentially who is holding the power to make that change that you feel like you want to see happen? Is it lawmakers? Is it, you know, a specific community group? Is it the city government? You know, is it a neighborhood association? This could look different depending on what you're working on, but that's what a power map looks like. And a leadership ladder. So that the leadership ladder has to do with how are you involving constituents in your work and then promoting them through the leadership of your organization. So as you're hiring for new folks, are you hiring from within? Are you hiring from your constituency? Are you moving folks through the leadership of your organization from your base of supporters? So those are some components of community organizing. And then I want to add two, you know, alternatives to what community organizing can look like, because, you know, particularly in what is happening right now, you know, as our world is shifting in response to this pandemic, things might look a little bit different than organizing out in front of the Capitol. You know, direct action work might not be feasible. And there are other ways that we consider organizing work to look like. So cultural organizing is one of these. So this is integrating arts and culture into organizing strategies. I think a great example of this is local organization Creative Strategies for Change. I'd recommend looking them up if you're interested to know if your arts work is potentially a good fit. And also, this is about organizing from a particular tradition of cultural identity, community of place, or worldview. Al Frente de Lucha is a good example of this, sort of bringing youth out to land in New Mexico and sharing cultural traditions during a summer camp, building a sense of a community, and then taking that back into the community when they come back into their organizing strategies. So that's a note on cultural organizing. And then healing justice is another piece that we really consider that looks different than that sort of more structured community organizing definition. And this is how our oppressed communities holistically responding to and intervening on general generational trauma and violence. So it's like, how are folks taking care of their own communities, taking care of themselves? I think a great example of this, in addition to frontline farming that's mentioned here, is Soul to Soul. I know they have a Black women-led project where it's a space of healing, a space of rest for women who have been organizing and doing all kinds of activist work just to take care of themselves. And that, is the kind of work that could potentially be in line with our funding as well. It looks like I have a question here for specific requirements for fiscally sponsored projects. I think the requirements for fiscally sponsored projects is just a working MOU and financials that accurately reflect your situation. I'm happy to answer a more specific question if you're wondering, or if you have a situation that is non-traditional. Okay, I just want to take a brain break, give you all 5 minutes to sit with all of this information, see if there are questions that are burning. I am happy to unmute you if you want to ask me a question specifically, but just going to give everybody a 5-minute break. And then we'll come back at like 1:55 and I'll pick up and keep going after that. And it looks like there's a question from, all right, okay, so we have a question about fiscal sponsorship. You fiscally sponsor a group that works in Colorado, New York, and let's see. Oh, sorry, is it Acelia? I'm happy to unmute you if you want to ask a little bit more specific about this.
Did it
I think
work?
it would depend. Yeah, hey. Yeah.
Yeah, we were just talking between us, Alicia, the Her Many Voices Foundation leader, and then the leader of the group that we work with, First Foods, Brooke. They're also in this workshop. And we were just talking between us if it would qualify, since we're Colorado based, but Her Many Voices Foundation has more than that $150,000 threshold. First Foods does not. And they would be doing a project in Colorado with us, but they're based in New York. So I don't know if that mutually excludes us, or if that would work. So I was just trying to understand the intricacies of that.
So you're saying you all as an organization have a budget over $350,000, but you're fiscally sponsoring a group in New York who meets?
Well, they're based in New York, but they work across the country. They have projects. Right now they're online because of COVID. And they'll probably continue to do online work. And then they were developing a project that would be a Colorado project, in addition to the one that they do in New York. So we would be working with them, and we work with them on all of them, but specifically with the Chinook Fund, it would be the Colorado project that we'd be involved with, that they would be applying for.
Yeah, it could potentially work. We are really focused on groups that are based locally, just doing work locally. But I think that could be a situation where you could apply for project funds if the project was really well aligned with our criteria. Okay. So I'd be happy to talk, I think, after this call about alignment.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't want to take up, but thank you for that. It's helpful because yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Brooke or Alicia, if you have more to flesh out, please chime in. I don't know. I know they're here, but. And thanks again for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're still in brain break time, so it's okay if you all have questions. I'm seeing some more showing up here. Yes, as a note, I will be, so this is being recorded and I will upload this to YouTube, all 2 lovely hours of it, so you can go back and rewatch, and the slides will be accessible as well. I'll see if I can link them on the YouTube. I think that would probably be helpful. Let's see, I have a question here about mentoring youth. I actually think what I'd love to do is save any specific alignment questions for your organization till the end. But if you have like clarifying questions around the criteria, I am going to talk a lot more about what our process looks like. But if you have an organization specific question, I'm going to wait till the end so that I can sort of cover stuff that relates to everyone. Let's see. Working as a part of a New York-based group, but have a Colorado chapter. Yeah, so if we're talking about a national organization with a chapter, I think the big sort of distinction that we want to see is, you know, is your budget separate from that national group? Do they have significant control over your organization? Because that, I think, could potentially be a disqualifier. We want to know that like the power is resting in your organization here locally as opposed to, you know, following national direction. So hopefully that helps a bit. Statewide organization. Organization. Kat, this sounds like an interesting situation because it seems like you could do either. So it may not matter, but I'm happy to talk to you after after this workshop to see exactly what it is that you're asking, because I don't know that I'm sure. All right, so just a second for you all to digest, maybe another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll keep rolling on. Unless folks have specific questions about clarifying the criteria or anything else that I've shared, that's sort of a more general question. Okay, I think we will continue on here. I just want to share more about our grantees because I think this is really a great way to get a sense of, you know, are you doing the kind of work that Chinook would fund? Get to know our grantees so that you can see firsthand what kind of work we do fund. So over the last, what are we at? We're almost at 33 years now of Chinook Fund being around. Oh, I apologize, I didn't share at the beginning. I've been on staff for 7.5 years at Chinook, started as an administrative manager and, you know, slowly started taking on more and more responsibilities. When I started, I think we were a 2-person team and now we're up to 5. So it's great to see the organization grow. So we've given out over 1,000 grants, over 3.6 million in grant dollars to 386 organizations in our legacy as a funder, which we're really proud of. I'm going to share this video. Pause Zoom recording and chat so I can see you all and move through just to give you a sense of who our grantees are now. Unfortunately, this evaluation is pretty dated. We had a former Giving Project member actually who is skilled in evaluation. Take a look at grants from 2013 to 2017 to take a look at the categories of the kind of work that we were funding. And so that's what's shown here. You can see ton of youth organizing and also art, culture, and media. And this, I actually think, informs our focus on community organizing. We really want to hone in on, you know, prioritizing that kind of work. Moving forward, we really want to hone in on folks that are doing that kind of work. And also, organizations could identify in more than one category. But there are a lot of groups focused on youth organizing here in Denver. I think it's telling, you know, what organizing looks like in the state and sort of in the middle of the country and where folks are focusing. And then this, I think, informs our rural organizing focus. This heat map was showing where our money was being distributed over these 4 years. And you can see big bubble right around Metro Denver. And there is organizing that's happening in all corners of the state. And we really want to make sure that money gets moved to all around. So the rural priority area here. I'm hoping to get more updated data because things have definitely shifted after 2017. So ways that you can get to know our grantees. Go to our website, chinookfund.org/grantees, click around to take a look at the groups that we've been funding recently. And then attend our next Meet the Changemakers. At our last Meet the Changemakers, we had a representative from the local Black Lives Matter, an Indigenous-led organization, Urban Gardens Wellness, that's more rural focused, a rural Latinx organizing focused group, and then an arts and activist group called Creative Strategies for Change. That recording is actually on YouTube, I believe. It was just such an inspiring evening, even though it was on Zoom. All of the panelists really connected, talking about the work that they're doing and the kind of organizing that they're trying to do, and the, you know, the futures, the visions that they have for the futures of our community and their specific community. It was incredibly beautiful. Highly recommend watching that and also joining our next one in March. Unfortunately, it won't be before the next deadline, but still definitely recommend that you join if you're interested. And then I just want to touch back on the timeline, where we are right now. So the upcoming deadline is on the 22nd of February. That's a Monday. Typically the deadline is the 21st, but because that's a Sunday, we shifted it to the Monday. The screening meetings will happen in April. There is typically a notification, a call to organizations that are, you know, not selected for a site visit to let you know that you're not going to be funded. We try to communicate as soon as possible these, you know, when these decisions are made, so you're not waiting until the end of 6 months to know if you're funded or not. Site visits will be happening April to May. And those are all happening over Zoom, obviously, right now for safety amidst the pandemic. And then final decisions will happen in June, and then there will be a notification and grant disbursement at that time. Happy to share my contact. That'll all be in the slides. But you can always email grants@chinookfund.org if you're wanting to connect. That's an easy email to remember. Okay, now we're going to get into how do you actually apply. Gosh, I think it's been a year and a half since we switched from paper application and email submission, all of these sort of messy ways that folks were applying to a lovely online portal. We do still accept, you know, a paper application if you don't have access to internet. That's absolutely helpful, absolutely possible. I'm happy to help with that. But this is how most folks are applying, and you can get to this portal on tiny.cc/cfgrant, and it's open now, so you can go into the website and start an application if you're interested. Here you can see we're going to go over some like really fun details. You know, create a new account if your organization has potentially applied in the past. Or, you know, you type in, you know, you try to make a new account, it won't let you, just reach out to me. I'm happy to give you access information. There are some groups who have applied maybe, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and you no longer have access to that email. You know, we can figure things out for you. So of course, you'll be creating your account, organization information, individual user information. All of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory, but I do just want to take a second to cover it. I'm always happy to reset your password if you have any issues. If you don't know if you have an account, I'm happy to look that information up for you as well. I believe I covered this already. If you're not sure about any of this, please feel free to reach out. So the first piece is an eligibility quiz to even gain access to the application. We just want to eliminate folks applying who are, definitely not in alignment. So it's a budget and a location question. So if you pass that, then you'll have access to the application. And then you'll see on the actual portal page, it'll give you the option to apply, and this will say spring 2021 grant cycle, and you'll be able to click through. If you ever get lost at any point, you can always go up to the apply button and click there, and that will bring you into the application. And then these are all of the aspects of the application that you will be filling out. General inquiries, funding questions, narrative questions, a work plan upload, budget information, leadership information, a specific piece called the diversity chart that we'll go over in a bit, and then 3 references for your organization. If you're interested in pulling all of this information off of the portal, if I know I personally am tired of screens, I'm sure you all are too, you can download a PDF of the question list and print that off for yourself, if that's helpful. So the deadline is the 22nd. It is a soft deadline. So, if you've started an application and you're like, something came up, life is happening, I need an extra day, reach out to me, let me know. I'm happy to make exceptions for folks if you need it. There are required questions. So, it won't let you submit unless you've filled out all the questions that have a little asterisk. For the most part, this will auto save. It'll give you a note if you're, going to time out or something like that. But it, generally always hit save or work on a longer question in a Word document so you don't lose any of your work. We wouldn't want that to happen. And like I said, you can download the question list if you want that. And of course, you can fill out part of it, leave, come back. If you need some time. And you can also see the status of any applications you've submitted via your dashboard on the portal. And you can access that by clicking the home button. So yes, when you hit that home button, you're able to click through and edit that application if you want to. Like I said, a soft deadline, so you'll still have access to all of your information, even if that deadline passes. But ideally, get it in by the deadline so that you are prioritized in terms of application review. And then, the portal will automatically log you out after 90 minutes if you're hanging out online for a while, but this is also the steps that you can take to actually sign out. A lot of other funders are using this software. So the other thing to note is make sure you go specifically to our link because you won't be able to access our application through any other funder's iteration of the software, just as a note. Okay, so the details of the application here. We're going to want your mission statement, your organization location, your 501c3, your EIN number. If you're in the process of getting one, let me know. We can figure out how to work around that in the system, but the system is going to ask you to enter the EIN number of your organization or of your fiscally sponsored organization. There's 10 narrative questions that are going to ask you the history of your organization, how you see yourself aligning with the criteria, what the larger movement building strategies look like, fundraising strategies, and we'll cover those in a bit. Information about what kind of grant you're going to apply for, and I'll cover that in just a second. Where you're planning to spend your funds, what your operational budget looks like. We do ask that you submit a work plan. It doesn't have to be super polished or super detailed, but we just want to know, what are you working on? Yeah, how are those pieces that you're working on related to creating lasting change? Budget information, we want to know where you're planning to spend the funds. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Leadership information. So we love to see a bio for each board staff and other leadership member. name where, what brought you to the work. This is sort of subjective. It's up to you what kind of information you want to share in your bios of your staff and board, but we just like to see who folks are. Now, if there's a situation where you're feeling unsafe, depending on documentation status, the kind of work that you're doing, maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing names, that's absolutely okay. Anonymous bios are also accepted. If that's the case, please feel free to reach out to me if there's any situation of feeling discomfort in sharing information. We're absolutely sensitive to that, and we don't want to force folks to share information they don't feel comfortable sharing. And then the last two pieces are the diversity chart and references. Diversity chart, I'm going to go into detail around. References, this is 3 local references that are not a part of your board staff or other leadership. Sometimes we have folks put board members down, but that would be kind of a conflict of interest if they're a reference for the organization. So someone that you work with who is privy to your work, who can speak to that is what we're asking for. So in addition to the work plan, we have an area where you can enter goals. This just helps us in our accountability and reporting pieces. So I would definitely recommend pulling the goals that you have in your work plan or the pieces that you're working on in your work plan and just type them into these goal fields. You'll see that there are character limits. Please, we don't expect you to fill your responses to the brim of character limits. Less is more. Yeah. Let's see. So narrative questions, there's 10 of them in total. And this is really what our folks are going to be using to review your application and see if, 1, you're in good alignment with our criteria, and 2, if they want to go on a site visit, if they want to know more about your organization. And so these are the pieces that are covered in the narrative questions. The next slide is actually going to share those questions. So I'm just going to read these to you, and you can take some time to sit with them and see if there's anything that comes up for you. History, when did your group come together and why? Root causes, what is the specific problem or injustice your group is trying to solve? Action, lasting effect, what's your overall strategy for solving this injustice? What systems are you working to change? What actions will come out of your work? Constituent-led, who's most impacted by the injustice? How are those folks providing leadership and direction? How do you identify and develop new leaders? Community-wide, how does your organization define diversity within your constituency? How do you ensure that everyone is represented in your organization, especially those with less privilege? Organizational structure and decision-making, who decides what kind of work your group does? What's the decision-making process? This is like who holds power, who gets to make the decisions for your organization? How are you being held accountable to those decisions and making those decisions? Movement building, how does your group see itself as a larger movement for social change? How do you connect with other social changes, issues, and communities? What kind of collaborations and coalitions are you in? Fundraising strategies, what are your current fundraising activities? How does your community support your organization? How will you sustain future work? Evaluation, how do you evaluate, reflect on, and make changes? And then just some logistical information for a site visit. What days and times are you available to meet with our folks? So happy to answer any questions about this section if they come up. I do just want to share some application terms that might be new for you and clarify what they mean for us. So you can elect to apply for general operating or project support. Sounds like in the case of the organization I was chatting with earlier, project support might make more sense for them. Typically, we recommend that folks apply for general operating support. That way you can use funds for salaries, you can use funds for rent. So many funders only want to fund program related work. We want you to use the money where you see fit. If your work is in alignment with our criteria, we trust you. Use these funds the way you want to. So recommend applying for general operating unless you have a situation like scholarships. And so applying for project support would say, okay, the money is not going to go to that. It's only going to go to the more community organizing work, if that was the case. Current annual budget, we typically look at the total of your income line item for the year. So that would be what you would enter where that $350,000 cap would come into play. If you have a capital campaign, if you are trying to buy a building, if you're fiscally sponsoring an organization, we only want to know the operating budget, not necessarily your big overall budget that includes those big numbers. Fiscal year, just want to clarify this. Most folks operate on a calendar fiscal year, January to December, and if that's the case for you, that's great. You don't need to worry. For us at Chinook Fund, our fiscal year begins July 1st. So there is a question asking about that. When does your budget start and end? We do have two types of grants you can apply for, a startup grant or an established grant. Startup grants are eligible for groups that are less than 4 years old, typically. And if you are less than 4 years old, I recommend that you apply as a startup. We definitely have folks who come in and they're like, nope, we know what we're doing. We want to go for that $10,000. We're going to apply for established. That is your choice. Though, knowing that if you apply as an established, you're then sort of in a pool with organizations that may have been around for 30 years or more, who are really well established in the community. And the other big distinction between startup and established is that if you're a new organization, we're not going to ask you to have quantifiable, like successes, concrete successes in the same way that an established group would be expected to. So there's just like a bit more leniency around showing that the work that you're doing will have specific outcomes and pieces like that if you're a startup organization. Though, the trade-off is you can apply for less funds. Typically recommend that you apply for the full amount, whether startup or established. So apply for that full 4,000, apply for that full 10,000. As a note, because our Giving Project folks are fundraising each grant cycle, we can't guarantee a certain grant amount. Now we're really trying to fund groups at least 70% of their requests. So, that's about 3,000, about 7,000, depending on startup or established. So the amounts fluctuate each grant making cycle depending on how much comes in for the Giving Project, that grant making cycle, just as a note. Organizational status, so that's whether you have a 501c3 or whether you're fiscally sponsored or in the process there. So you'll share the EIN number. And then if you're looking for a sample work plan, maybe you're a really new organization, you don't know what that looks like, please feel free to follow this link. It's also linked in the application itself. So you can click just to see an example of what that could look like. So happy to answer any questions about the details here. It's hard because I can't see all of your faces to see if you're feeling confused or on board. Okay, so items you'll have to upload. Your fiscal sponsorship agreement. Now, really, we ask for this just to make sure that you're protected, just to see who's making sure that your programs are, sort of in compliance, who's managing the budget, what sort of fees are being taken out, just so we have a sense. Work plan, leadership bios, so names and information about all the folks that are running your organization. The diversity chart, and then you have the option of sharing. You can use our specific budget form, which you can download, fill out the information there and upload. Maybe you're too new, you don't yet have, accountant created financials, that's okay. Or if you do have financials that are being compiled on the regular by a bookkeeper or an accountant, you can upload these three pieces here, your last year actuals, your current year approved budget and what has happened so far, and then your year-to-date actuals so that we get a sense of where you are financially. And this is just to cover our budget form, what kind of information we're asking for. So last fiscal year, if you're on a calendar year, fiscal year, last fiscal year, this would be like what happened in 2020 in terms of your income, individual contributions, if you have membership dues, foundation grants. We just want to see who you're being funded by. Government grants, special events, and any other things that are coming in. So actuals here, your budget and what has happened in this year to date. A note, you know, if you're on this current calendar year, then you don't need to worry about this because the grant will be dispersed in June and probably you'll be spending all of the funds in this current fiscal year. But if there is a unique case where the grant will be spent in your upcoming fiscal year, we would ask to have a budget for your upcoming fiscal year as well. And here's this note again, if you have a capital campaign, you're purchasing a building, just flag that to me so that I'm aware we don't screen you out for budget constraints. And then expenses, your actuals on wages that you're, you know, if there's stipends that you're giving out, any benefits, rent and utilities, all of that fun stuff, printing and copying, traveling, consultants in kind, and other pieces. Feel free to let me know if you have questions on any of this. This stuff is pretty self-explanatory. If you are applying for project support, we would ask that you submit a specific budget for that project, just so we have a sense of where funds will be going. And then, you know, this is lists where Chinook monies will be spent, might be salaries, might be rent. This is just so we get an idea on this part of the budget form. Okay, so now we're getting into the diversity chart. This is really the only way we have of quantifying, are you led by the folks that you say you are? Do you have community support in your base? And so here you'll just list the numbers of how many people you have on staff, how many people you have on your board, and how many people you have in what you consider to be other leadership. This could be an advisory board of some kind. You know, this is sort of up to your interpretation. It's folks that have significant leadership power in your organization that aren't on staff or on your board. And so the numbers that you input here, I'm going to go into your diversity chart and check that those numbers line up, just so that we have an accurate sense of who's in power at your organization. And so this is the diversity chart. Sometimes this can be a little confusing to fill out. Essentially, what I am going to look for is, do the numbers that you put in this previous list here line up when I add across horizontally for each one of these categories, right? So do you have 3 staff members? Do you have 3 staff members in age, 3 staff members in sexual orientation, 3 staff members in terms of gender identity? And this, you know, is an opportunity for you to chat with your staff about how they identify. We definitely don't want you to assume. Please ask. And so, you know, maybe sexual orientation isn't something you talk about on staff, and that's okay. This could be an opportunity for you to bring up that conversation, because if you're not, it's worth interrogating whether folks feel safe, what your organizational culture is like. And there, you know, there are definitely situations where maybe folks don't feel comfortable, you don't feel comfortable asking. That is okay. You know, definitely open to situations where there could be safety concerns, certain cultural norms where it's just not something that's spoken about or shared, and that's all right. Please share that in the constituent leadership section of your narrative, just so that we know. But in general, you know, we'd love to get all this information about the folks that are leading your organization, so we get an accurate picture. And the one thing I do want to stress, add in other identities that are important and relevant to you. We have folks who add their current housing situation, whether they are immigrants, undocumented immigrants, you know, depending on safety, religious affiliation, you know, interactions with the criminal justice system, parents, not parents, you know, what are the identities that are relevant to you? We want to know, we care. We want to know what your community looks like. Any questions on the diversity chart? This, you know, you download this as a Word document, and you can actually, or I think an Excel document, and you can click into each cell to type in a number. Here's an example, right? And this is a previous iteration of Chinook Fund staff that's shifted now, but you know, if we have 4 people on staff, we have 1 person that identifies as Asian, 1 person that identifies as a Latina, 1 person identifies as multiracial, 1 person identifies as white or European, and then you know, there's 4 people here, and then there's also 4 people listed under this bracket as well in terms of age. The other piece I want to note here on the diversity chart is the option to self-identify. Maybe your gender expression is not listed here. Please self-identify. We have lots of extra spots here, or even class position, sexual orientation. Yeah, please use what feels right to you in terms of how you identify. Okay, so some last sort of details in terms of application, then I'm happy to answer questions. In terms of ability to be reapplying or not, if your application is funded, you can reapply in a year. So you can only be funded once a year. So say you're funded in the spring, you can't then reapply for the fall, in terms of how our process is working right now. So you could apply and be funded once a year. If your application is denied funding, you can reapply the following cycle, but I wouldn't recommend doing it unless we talk and I'm like, oh, okay, we have greater clarity, things have shifted for you. So I don't recommend applying twice in a year if you've been declined, unless there's a specific situation that we've talked about. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to review your application if you're interested, though don't ask me to do that like, 2 days before the deadline. Ideally give me at least a week, but happy to take a look and give you feedback if you're interested in that. Ideally you're submitting online via the GLM, the Grant Lifecycle Manager portal. If you hit submit and something's missing, I will be in touch. I contact everyone. If there's anything missing, you'll get a confirmation email. If not, and then you can always reach me via grants@chinookfund.org or jnelson@chinookfund.org. I get all of the emails into my inbox. Again, deadline is February 22nd. Link to apply is here, tiny.cc/cfgrant. Yeah, so there's a YouTube series if you want to even more deep dive into these details. If you search Chinook Fund Grant Application Workshop, the recording of today's session will be found at this tiny.cc link, probably tomorrow, maybe early next week, and then the link to apply again, tiny.cc/cfgrant. So I am here to answer your questions. Got about half an hour left on the time here. Feel free to hang out if you're interested. I will do what I can to unmute everyone, but so far that's our workshop today. So thanks for joining, and hopefully this was informative and helpful. I'm going to turn off recording now.